Camp Meade was born as the war to end all wars raged in Europe. The Civil War had ended only 2 generations earlier in 1865. It remains the bloodiest war in U.S. history, and at the time, Americans were in no mood to fight again. When German attacks in the Atlantic grew and the so-called Zimmermann telegram raised the specter of Mexico becoming an ally of Germany, Woodrow Wilson had no choice but to declare war.
America's answer to the threat from abroad, the threat of the German armies, also becomes more vigorous in the summer of 1918. Doubts of national conscience, fears about security, are dimmed by triumphant scenes from the Western Front.
Enter a man named John Charles Linthicum, a Maryland state senator and later congressman. He was first to introduce a bill making the Star-Spangled Banner the official national anthem. And he even co-wrote an important amendment that led to the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. But he is widely credited with the vision to bring Fort Meade to Maryland.
He and a group of businessmen estimated $20 million in benefits could accrue to the state if one of these cantonment areas was put in Maryland. So they put together their best equivalent of PowerPoint for the day and worked with the War Department to tout why Maryland. 22 miles from the port of Baltimore, close to Washington, D.C., so the VIPs could come up and check out the training for themselves. 2 major rail lines feeding into a junction at Annapolis Junction, and a central location. Not a lot of population, so less turmoil than other places might have represented.
The push to war began in earnest. Wilson sought to build an army of 2 million soldiers from a standing army of only about 100,000. The draft was established, and the American doughboy was born. More than 500,000 soldiers would pass through Camp Meade during World War I.
What does a 17 or an 18 or a 19-year-old know about war? We had in our institutional memory as a country the Civil War. No one was prepared, even the officers training, for what they were going to see in the battlefields of Europe during World War I. The officers were still being trained in our academies in Napoleonic-style tactics. And they were thrown into a new environment where technology reigned. World War I really started war as we know it today, with sophisticated machinery. So these young men were excited and listened to the recruiters and joined up because they were patriotic, and they had no idea what they were going to see in the battlefields overseas.
World War I might have been the beginning of a new era of technology and warfare, but you wouldn't know it from visiting Camp Meade. The car was still a pretty new thing, with the Ford Model T going into production in 1908. That meant that Meade was home to a whole lot of horses. You could have seen up to 12,000 horses there at one time, and that meant 6,000 bales of hay per day.
There was a remount station that was established at Camp Meade for the Army to procure horses and mules from all of the surrounding areas and prepared for shipment to France, because artillery pieces tended to be horse or mule drawn. They were still using wagons, and that kind of thing was still a role for horses and mules in the Army. Our Camp Meade was one of the main assembly points in the mid-Atlantic for livestock to support the Army operations. So yeah, it's a huge logistics challenge to deal with that. The men that were training at Camp Meade in the 79th Division struggled with a lack of equipment. They didn't have rifles. There weren't sufficient rifles to give to the troops, so initially they drilled with wooden staves, pretending they were rifles. There were wooden mock-ups of machine guns and wooden mock-ups of artillery pieces. So it wasn't until really 1918 that sufficient weapons began to arrive at Camp Meade to support more realistic training.
Men weren't the only ones heading off to war from Camp Meade. Women were also there as a part of the Signal Corps. They were called Hello Girls because their job was to operate the switchboards on the Western Front. More than 7,000 women applied, but only 450 were accepted to serve overseas. They were trained at Camp Meade.
The Hello Girls were the first women who were inducted into the United States Army. The preponderance of them came here once Camp Franklin was built, the Signal Corps School that was here on Camp Meade, and about 425 ladies came through Camp Franklin to get their basic training. And they were given rank. So first lieutenant got the same amount of money that a male lieutenant, which was $33 a month, out of which she had to pay for her own uniform. They had to speak English and French, so there were special requirements that they had to meet that any doughboy didn't. They also had to have switchboard experience, telephone switchboard, and they also could never have been married. The Army didn't want to induct any divorcees or widows that might have children, because a lot of these ladies served right on the front.
Grace Benker was one of the most famous Hello Girls because she was the chief operator, worked for President Wilson, and received a Distinguished Service Medal for her actions, which included leading her team through trenches with gas masks and working out of bombed-out buildings on the front. They were put in harm's way because French operators simply wouldn't work.
The French had operators, and the French women were a bit snooty, and when an American officer couldn't speak perfect French, je coupe, I cut you off. So that's how they got that nickname, the Hello Girls, because when an officer got through and he heard an American voice, he kept going, hello? And it's like, oh, a hello girl. That's how they got the name. They were so excited to have an American voice on the other end.
On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the war was over less than 2 years after the United States had entered.
So after World War I, we'd created a tank corps in France. We wanted to keep that, but we hadn't had that before the war, so the question was, what do we do with all these tanks and the soldiers that have learned how to operate them and fight with them and so on. And Camp Meade was selected as the home of the tank corps. The officer left in France to bring all the tanks together and ship them back to the United States was Patton. Patton had distinguished himself with the tank corps during World War I before he was wounded. But he recovered from his wound and oversaw that and brought the tanks back to Camp Meade and set up the tank corps under the command of Brigadier General Rockenbaugh.
Later history would bring together two giants of American warfare in politics, George Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1921, you might not have foreseen Ike becoming President of the United States. He never got to see any action in World War I. He spent most of the war stateside leading training operations. Patton, on the other hand, was commander of the 304th Tank Brigade in the war and was battle-tested.
And it's actually here that they met for the first time. They knew of each other, but they met here and they formed a deep friendship, in part because they were thrown together. Back then, we provided a house, and it was a duplex for the officers. So Eisenhower and Patton were put next to each other in an officer duplex right here on Camp Meade.
Patton and Eisenhower became really good friends, but they grew up in very different families. You would think the man who would become president would come from the rich family and cultured upbringing. It was actually quite the opposite.
Patton was the American blue blood everywhere he went. He brought a string of 12 polo ponies with him. Eisenhower, son of a Kansas sod farmer, threw them together. Imagine how much they had in common, like zip, other than loving the Army and seeing the future for tanks.
Patton himself believed in offense, offense, offense. He wrote a saber manual for when people very rarely fought with swords. As a cavalry officer, he did not want to teach the soldiers to parry or block, only attack. If you line up your attack properly, you will be protected behind it. If the guy sees your attack vigorously enough, he will only think to defend himself, and you won't have to defend yourself. That was his sword concept. So, when a vulnerable horse and rider could instead be inside an armored fighting vehicle, Patton was thrilled. He was one of the first proponents of armored warfare for the United States.
This 4-foot-long panoramic photo, taken at Camp Meade in 1920, tells us so much about the period. If you look really closely, you can see the young officers who would make history together and the British and French tanks that laid the groundwork for the Shermans that were a staple of World War II. You can also study the sea of young soldiers prepared to fight for the greatest army on earth.
And actually that panoramic picture was right outside my office at the post headquarters when I was in command. So I walked by it every day, and I used to look at the faces that were there. And Patton and Eisenhower are striking, and they stand out. It's like, yeah, there they are. But there's other figures in there. There's one soldier that doesn't look like he's any older than 12 or 13 that's there. Then you get the grizzled ones, and there's just a wide assortment of faces. And I kept looking because in those panoramic pictures, as they shot those, the camera moved slowly across the way, and there's legends of troops on the one end racing and getting in the picture twice. And I kept looking for a face that showed that, and I never found one.